3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. We are truly pleased to have you with us today for an exclusive LHoFT Vistra and EURintelligence webinar special edition with Roberto De Primis and Gino Zabeo on a new geopolitical landscape and global opportunities to seize post-COVID-19. A little bit about their backgrounds. Roberto De Primis is CEO of EURintelligence, a geopolitical risk and risk management consulting group based in Brussels. After almost 20 years of professional experience in the Belgian government, the European Parliament, and the United Nations in New York, Roberto created his consulting group in order to better advise and protect companies' interests around the world and help them grow internationally. Roberto is visiting lecturer at the Sorbonne University and invited research at the University of Quebec in Montreal. On top of that, Roberto is an invited expert for television and radio about international relations issues. Gino Zabeo. Gino has 9 years of experience with Vistra as VP of Client Services, during which he managed a significant portfolio of clients comprising US-based companies at the forefront of medical science and high-tech innovation. Gino graduated with a first-class degree in economics from the University of Verona in Italy. He qualified with PwC as a chartered accountant in the UK and worked in audit and insurance for both in the UK and in Italy. Before joining Vistra in the UK, Gino held positions as finance director in private groups in Italy. Gino has 3 teenage boys, lives in the UK, and is a keen 100 miles ultra runner. On the moderator side, we have our co-host and colleague Alex Panikan, head of partnerships and ecosystem development at LHoFT. Prior to joining LHoFT, Alex was a serial entrepreneur creating companies in the space of e-commerce and the like. He holds an MBA from the University of Quebec in Montreal, where he also taught marketing and strategy as a teaching associate for almost 5 years. At LHoFT, he's been traveling the world connecting fintech entrepreneurs with the local ecosystem and has been a master of ceremony interviewing thought leaders from all walks of life. Sirs, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for the kind introduction. And we have to talk about the EUChina afterwards, Roberto. I didn't know that you were part of the EUChina. It's good.
Yeah.
So, guys, thank you so much for being with us. Hello, everybody. So, guys, we just faced, I think, one of the biggest sanitary crises for the last 100 years. The world economy has just stopped for 2 months. And I was reading yesterday in Financial Times, economists predict that we'll face one of the biggest depression ever in our history. So let's see for that. But what really worries me is the geopolitical tension we see between US and China today. And even we might foresee a new Cold War. We'll hear that maybe from Roberto. And I think they will have huge ripple effect towards Europe, towards our businesses, and for the world economy, as it say. But hey, life moves on. So we already see some increase in economy, at least in Europe. Business activity is back. And there is always opportunity for the ones that know where to look. So the question is, where should we look? And how to best prepare to grab the opportunity where it stays. And to respond to the 2 important questions, at least for me, we have 2 experts in geopolitics and internalization. So Roberto, let's start with you with the first question. What the heck is going on in the world right now, and where should we look for opportunities? Roberto, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Alex, and thank you all for coming for this very interesting LHoFT webinar today. This presentation will last around 10-12 minutes, and it will be focused on 3 parts. First and briefly, the current wave of COVID-19, because we heard a lot about this pandemic, and then the restart of our lives and economies, and then the third part, the longest one, the one on which we will focus on geopolitical outlook, and we'll discuss about the threats and opportunities ahead. So let's start with the presentation about the current wave on the next slide. Briefly, a few figures to show the strength of the COVID-19 hit. In 1 month, the number of US jobs lost equaled the number of jobs that took a decade to be created. And in 2007, 2008, it took more than a year for the S&P 500 to lose 50% of its value. In 2020, right now, the market lost 30% in only 1 month. COVID-19
but
economical.
it rebounds 40% in 3 days.
Yeah,
it's crazy right now. Sorry.
Yeah,
I had
no,
to mention that
totally.
because the market are just off the charts.
Yeah, yeah, of course. But bear in mind that COVID-19 economical nightmare happened even though major political and economical decisions were taken by governments and central banks. So the ability and willingness were substantial, but the effectiveness was unfortunately quite low. On top of that, something central was missing, and it's the global coordination. So on the next slide, about the restart, the second wave, if we have a second wave, I underline this, could happen if with the restart of business travel from countries with less control. For example, before March 2020, there were no cases of COVID-19 in sub-Saharan Africa. And the first case happened because an Italian worker went back to the oil field in Nigeria. As of today, some of the strategic countries for business where new COVID-19 cases are still reported are Brazil, Mexico, India, Russia, and Chile. But there are still a lot of questions about the shape of the recovery. Will it be a V, a U, a W, or maybe a long flat curve, meaning a long depression? That's still a question. China, the first country to be affected, bounced back with a V-shaped recovery and a vivid response. But Chinese consumer spending is still down 10%. So one certainty, we will experience a 90% economy in the following 6 to 12 months. So still about the restart on the next slide, here is a mix that could push us into a long recession during the restart. Higher debt, lower productivity, associated with other uncertainties, such as risk aversion from consumers and companies. As it turns out, the Great Depression generation was a risk aversion generation, and governments tried to avoid the same trend in 2020. During this restart, the public-private partnership will increase. You heard about SpaceX, and SpaceX is just one early example of the world ahead. About the vaccine, should a vaccine be found, and I use really the conditional here, should a vaccine be found in 2021, it will take years to produce it on a global scale and vaccine the whole world population. But we have one certainty: the longer we will wait for a vaccine, the more pronounced the effect on the economy will be. So let's go on the next slide.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Please.
What do you mean by, can you come back, Anthony? Yeah, the Great Depression generation was a risk aversion generation. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, because they were stressed about what was going on at that period. There were less news, of course, no social media, etc., and so on. They had no news of the countries bouncing back. Now we have an idea of what's happening in China and how the economy bounced back, so we can prepare, we can better prepare our economies for a bounce back. But at that time, they were afraid of the future, and they became a risk aversion economy and generation. They did not spend their money into non-useful things. So it became a 10-year risk aversion generation. And governments try to avoid this with central bank action and government putting a lot of a huge amount of money and creating debts. So this is the difference between what happened decades ago, almost a century ago, and what is happening right now.
Okay, thank you. Interesting.
My pleasure. So going to the next part, which is the geopolitical outlook and the threats, and above all, the opportunities ahead. So this crisis is not a game changer. This crisis accelerates some trends that could have taken years to develop. talking about deglobalization, tech invasion, talking here about tracking and other kind of app, protectionism, Chinese-US Cold War, social and economical inequalities, and so on and so on. So this crisis, except being an accelerator, is also a shock for globalization. We won't avoid several years of deglobalization. Reshoring will be the trend for the short and the midterm. The new motto in Washington could be in the US for the US. And I think you're going to hear this kind of motto going on towards the US presidential election, which will be held on November the 3rd. But let's get back a few months ago and bear in mind what President Trump said at the United Nations General Assembly in September 2019. The future does not belong to globalists, but belongs to patriots and sovereign and independent nation. This kind of sentence gives you an idea of the trends that was already going on in 2019 and even before. So the pandemic.
I think you are the first person to quote Donald Trump that I know.
But this one, it was to give you all the detail and the good background to understand that what's going on right now accelerate trends that were already going on, starting from, let's say, 2016, the incoming of Donald Trump at the White House. But let me go on telling you that the pandemic hit when the global economic system was already under threat. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, was already weakened. The US-China trade war is not finished, and tensions among them will reignite before the US presidential election. In other words, the biggest threat to globalization is not coming from the pandemic itself, but rather from the policies that will follow. We need then to check the protectionist policies that will be taken. Then on the next slide, you'll see on the right side that I put the global political agenda until the end of 2020. And this will give you an idea of what's ahead, and that we will have a lot of challenge before the end of 2020. Just bear in mind that the G7 summit, which was due to happen at the end of June, is postponed to September, and French President Macron asked to have a physical and not a virtual summit at that time. You heard a lot about tension in Hong Kong. There will be legislative election in September. The UN General Assembly mid-September in New York. We'll see if there is a global coordination and cooperation at that time. I already talked about the US presidential election, a G20 summit under Saudi Arabian presidency in November, and then last but not least, Brexit. It will be the end of the transition period on December 31st. So this calendar gives you an idea that we had a huge shock on globalization, but we're going to have I have still a lot of concern about the rest of 2020 for the threats, but maybe also for opportunities we'll see later on. So on the next slide, still about geopolitical outlook, we did not hear that much about climate change recently, but it's still a huge concern. The ambition Green Deal is still on track. So what about the rest of the planet after COVID-19? It's still an open question. But the European Commission has presented a green recovery plan that will focus on buildings renovation, renewables, mainly wind and solar, clean hydrogen economy, and clean mobility. And about now the relation between China and the US, we acknowledge that Beijing is not a competitor anymore for Washington, but has become an enemy. We enter a kind of Cold War II. But here, right now, with two economies highly integrated. For this reason, the US and China won't go to war, but the rhetoric will be tougher until the US presidential election. China, on his side, has seen its soft power highly damaged. I would be pleased to hear the answer from our attendees to the following two questions. Who wants to travel to China today, and who is attracted by China and trusts China these days? So let's go now to the next slide and have a look at the world ahead. Just a few words about Africa. Unfortunately, we have a lack of statistical figures from this continent. So either Africans are safe, or the COVID-19 wave will impact the continent with a longer delay. About the terrorism threat, silently some terrorist groups take advantage from the weaknesses of certain countries, mainly in Africa and in the Middle East. In other words, a second wave could be a wave of terrorist attacks rather than a second wave of COVID-19. So now let's go to the conclusion in the next slide, the new alliances ahead. Just a few words, let's talk about the relation between the US, the European Union, and a new key player in Southeast Asia, I said Vietnam. Hanoi is emerging very well from the pandemic. They applied a mask diplomacy with success, sending masks to Russia, the US, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, and the UK. On top of that, Vietnam was already benefiting from the US-China trade war, and now the coronavirus pandemic raised the soft power of Vietnam. So it will be a key challenger in the following months and years, and it's a big winner, if I can say so, of this pandemic crisis. Let's talk a little bit now about the EU-Japan partnership. The two are getting closer. They signed a free trade agreement a few months ago and held recently a virtual summit. They have a common COVID-19 and vaccine strategy, and they prepared together the next G7 summit. This alliance has to be monitored then. And then let's go to the next slide for ideas for tomorrow. On this conclusive slide, I try to introduce some ideas for the future. First of all, we need a global Green Deal, but for a green recovery. Climate change and COVID-19 are interlinked crises. So I do believe that mainly in Europe, we will prioritize green investment and make new investment in low carbon tech. This trend is ongoing, and COVID-19 won't stop the EU on its path. Another idea for the future is a balanced globalization. Because the globalization post-COVID-19 must avoid an overcorrection, in other words, a full swing back to the hyper-globalization of the 90s, but also avoid an undercorrection. So globalization must then be balanced, resilient, secure, and sustainable. And then now on the next slide, still the ideas for tomorrow, let's have a few words about tech and cyber issues. Into my list of ideas for tomorrow, I consider a top priority to see more investment in both physical and digital infrastructure. Because yes, the cyberspace still needs investment. We also need a digital convention protecting people from cyber attack, a sort of digital Geneva Convention. Because with an increasingly connected world and more home working job, we witness a rise of cyber attacks and virus. This would mean a higher cost for insurance companies covering cyber threats. And in other words, we also need to increase the cyber resilience of our companies, business, and countries. So, well, I hope this presentation from my company, EURintelligence, and the ideas for tomorrow's will trigger some good business tips for you and protect your business model for tomorrow. So thank you all. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Anthony. And I give you back the floor for the question and the next speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roberto. We do have a lot of questions, in fact. So let's maybe one question before moving to Gino, if you don't mind. Anthony, can you give the mic, please, to Matthew Giacomo, please? Oh, I'll just read. You know what? I'm going to read it, so it's going to be faster. Okay. So Matthew is asking, did the COVID bring proof of frailty of emerging countries, especially the so-called BRICS? So I guess Matthew's question is, did the COVID-19 change the game plan for the BRICS?
Well, the BRICS are more now the BRICS, because I'm going to put out China, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. China is part of the group, but we are not including it anymore. Emerging countries are going to suffer because they are selling a lot of raw material to the rest of the planet. And as you can see right now, COVID-19 is also a crisis of demand and not of production. So demand in raw material sold by these emerging countries are totally down and quite low right now. And even though we are getting back to a 90% economy, as I said before, for China, I don't think we're getting back to the level of the past. So quite a lot of emerging countries will suffer this crisis, and they have to think about maybe switching a little bit to a different kind of business model, not only focusing all their attention and business model on raw material and commodities.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Roberto. Anthony, can you give, please, the mic to Gino?
Yes, of course. 1 second.
My God, we have a lot of questions. It's going to be an interesting conversation afterwards.
So, Gino, 1 second. I'll do the share screen. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Gino Zabeo from Vistra. I help businesses expand internationally, so it's a good segue for Roberto's excellent presentation and some really challenging thoughts there that obviously stimulated a lot of attention and a lot of ideas amongst the audience. And again, I think the focus here is managing risk, because clearly businesses are anxious. We sense it from our existing client base, but also the type of questions we're getting from new businesses that approach us, that are approaching the international market, because they are concerned not just for the existing operations, but they're worried about how they can maximize their potential when things get back to a new normal, obviously, as is being defined, so they can survive through the crisis and then perhaps thrive if they get through in a successful fashion. We're at the point in time when businesses, pretty much like an athlete, are injured and are suffering, but this is the time to rethink, and look inside to check whether there's any opportunities to get fitter and get stronger for when the recovery comes, and therefore take advantage of the opportunities that there will be available. And sometimes it will be a question of perhaps looking at the new normal in a way that will create new opportunities that perhaps were not there before, and therefore new ways of doing business, new ways of working, new ways of interacting with the client base, and new ways of delivering products and services. So in this new scenario, obviously there are opportunities, not just threats and risks, and it's a question of understanding what those opportunities are and maximizing the potential. So if we move to the next slide, we summarized this approach in a three-step phase to mirror what is going on in terms of global recession and global opportunities to recover, hopefully. So at this phase, in the phase that we're in now, we need to deal with the immediate disruption, and clearly there are things that impact the businesses on a daily basis, and new threats come from different sources, whether that's maintaining the business continuity, so having a business continuity plan in place, whether that's dealing with HR matters, or it's dealing with short supply of cash from the client base or from the business perspective itself, loan repayments. So considerations that businesses are going through and are facing today, and that were not prepared yesterday to deal with in such a short space of time. And clearly there's a list of priorities, so people have to focus on the priorities, and I think the main one is to ensure that, you know, for as best as they can, businesses can continue to operate, and can continue to operate even if it's a reduced pace, a reduced speed, but still stay viable. And that means managing cash as much as possible, and avoiding cash leakage in every possible way. And cash leaks through expenditures, leaks through tax, leaks through compliance, and therefore businesses should look at their own individual structures and the footprint to make sure that if they have any inefficiencies or any redundancies, this is the best opportunity to get rid of those inefficiencies. And that's the second phase, which is the recover, strengthen, and positive rebuilding. So businesses should look at their own corporate structure and see if there are any opportunities to get leaner and get fitter. And that can be getting rid of duplicate entities, or perhaps if they've grown through acquisitions and they have multiple entities in the same country, for example, they can optimize the structure in that country by consolidating everything in one entity. If they have several relationships with different vendors, for example, for the same product, then get better terms and conditions by renegotiating their own supply chain flows with individual vendors that are perhaps keener to offer better terms to continue doing business with that particular client. And therefore there are small steps that put together can offer some advantages and obviously offer some saving opportunities and efficiencies, but also rethinking overall, you know, the global footprint. So businesses shouldn't think of international expansion just to go after new markets and sales markets, but also they should be looking at international expansion as an opportunity to acquire talent. And the working from home experiment that everyone had to essentially deal with, willing or not, has given businesses an understanding of how that can work, and has also opened their minds to hiring talent perhaps further afield than they would have necessarily considered before. And that means that they can look at in other markets and other pools of talent that are perhaps in other countries, and tap into those by using lean structures that can employ those people and those resources without necessarily burdening the business with an excessive investment, but still giving them the opportunity to make the best of those talents and integrate them into their own processes, and therefore develop better services, better products. Because let's not forget that the economies these days primarily based on services, and therefore if we think of what we do on a daily basis, perhaps yes, we eat, we sleep, we continue to do that, but most of the time we're using services, and that can be content, that can be online shopping, and those services are provided by businesses that come up with new ideas, perhaps on a daily basis, on how to improve the experience of consumers and customers and clients in general. And therefore those services...
If I ask Gino, so to touch on the internationalization and the opportunities that you mentioned. So if I'm going outside, and we'll talk about which kind of region we should export our services if I'm a European company in a few minutes, but besides the talent that you mentioned, what are the other, let's say, factors you advise your clients to consider?
Yes, so when approaching an investment decision to expand internationally, clearly there are other considerations. Not the focus should be what is my objective, and therefore how do I achieve that objective in the most efficient way. And the time to execution is a factor, the risk management is another factor, and then the knowledge of the hidden costs of doing business in certain jurisdictions. Because yes, on paper all countries are open, but then in practice they do have ways of protecting their own internal businesses that can be very subtle, and until
like in US,
approach them and go through the process, you don't find out what those challenges are.
Okay, perfectly. What will be, if very practical question, how much money do I need to have as a minimum to look for expansion?
So it really the media answer is it depends. I mean, if you're after a small pool of talent, then it can be as little as perhaps 20% of the salary base, because that is roughly the cost of employing someone in a different jurisdiction. But in other countries where there's higher regulation, that percentage increases. And then in countries where there's an expectation of not just the money element of the remuneration, but also other soft areas such as comp and ben, medical insurance, etc., and compliance requirements, then the bill increases.
If I'm a fintech, let's say, because that's our field, if I'm a fintech, what should be my revenue? What would be my threshold, if you want, for you saying, okay, Alex, I think it's interesting for you now to move on and to go to other markets, because you have to generate more revenue. At least you have enough revenue in your own market to go outside. Are you having this discussion with your clients?
So my clients usually come to us when they get funded, and that gives them
the money. Okay.
Yeah, that gives them the platform, if you want, the confidence of to approach the international expansion. But the international expansion is a springboard. Even for a small startup, if you have flags all around the world, it makes you look bigger, and therefore it makes you look more attractive. It makes you look stronger and more credible, and therefore it spins off a virtual circle.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'll let you continue your presentation. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So in the next slide, we try to capture what the individual themes businesses should be looking at in these three phases, in these three steps that we try to summarize the contingent crisis that we're dealing with. So of course I mentioned the business continuity plan just to keep the lights on, but then look at the legal structure. So if we have, for example, dormant entities that we no longer need in certain countries, why not liquidate them so we save on costs of running the compliance for those entities? HR, because clearly there will be elements of the workforce that may need to have answers to certain questions as to how do we work from home in the future, how can we continue, how can we return to work, etc. So there are a great deal of HR discussions going on. Tax, because that's a consideration. So many countries have put in place contingent tax measures to relieve, for example, give tax payment holidays, give relief to businesses. So taking these opportunities to reduce the tax burden or defer the tax payments certainly helps with the cash flow and also the margin of businesses. And then through the recovery phase, which we are approaching now, for some countries we're already out, getting out of lockdown, and therefore it's time to strengthen the business, and that means renegotiating contracts with vendors, for example, having open discussions with the workforce as to maximize efficiencies within the teams, looking at the supply chain. So where there are different landing markets, for example, landing countries for imports of goods, why not consolidate all in one landing port that optimizes the flows and minimizes the tax burdens of moving goods around the world? And then once we are leaner and stronger, then we can approach the future with more confidence, and therefore take the opportunities that will be out there, but be more efficient in the time to market, and also in the risk management. So I guess the next slide will just offer a snapshot of the benefits of doing this in the short term, but also for the future and the long term. And I know that Roberto mentioned it, but there are other themes that have been perhaps underlying before COVID that every business should approach at some point in time. I think Roberto is right to say that COVID gave perhaps the impetus behind this rethinking, but businesses should pause every now and again and look at their own internal structure and go through a transformation, and that transformation will help them get stronger and take advantage of some of the benefits that are simply there to be to be uncovered. And if it's done in an efficient fashion, then it will prepare the business for the future opportunities. And again, the tax benefit is an obvious one, the financial results, the future profitability, but also there will be a better visibility of the business organization. If it's leaner and simpler to manage, then that will be more efficient and will be quicker to take decisions for businesses. And again, the cost of compliance will be reduced. So there are many factors that I think they're not just specific to the current situation, but they should be factored in and should be considered at some point in time in the business life cycle.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so I don't know if you still have some slides for us.
No, that was my presentation. So
perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gino, I'm
very
staying
much.
with you before giving the floor to the question, because Roberto mentioned Brexit. I mean, I forgot about Brexit, to be honest. We had so much going on right now. You are based in London, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
How do you see the Brexit coming, and what would be your advice for companies being on continental Europe looking to do business with UK?
Yeah, so Brexit is going to be another disruption or a disruptive catalyst, I think, but perhaps not all negative, and it might give opportunities for businesses both in the UK and in continental Europe. Brexit is essentially a recognition of a sentiment in the UK that perhaps has been lingering for some time. That my sense is that the people's mind were divided, and Brexit simply offered that opportunity to express that division internally. So it's only highlighted that in a result that was only marginal. However, now we have an opportunity to do something that is going to prepare both the UK but also the rest of Europe for a different type of relationship. And I think the direction is not 100% clear. That there's been distraction, obviously, with the COVID crisis, but businesses should be prepared to be brave and not fear Brexit. I think Brexit eventually
we don't have
will
a choice.
settle.
We don't have a choice.
No, that's right.
You don't have to. I mean, you just have to live it, right? It will
Exactly.
happen at one point. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gino, for your feedback and your advice. So I think we're gonna give the mic to the floor. So Anthony, I don't know if you can let maybe Dan start with the questions. Dan, you had a question about the China One Belt, the Belt One Road agenda. Dan, are you with us?
Yeah.
Please, Dan, go ahead.
I'm based in London myself, and there's a lot that's been built already by China with respect to the digital Silk Road. Look at places like Astana, Kazakhstan. And that's kind of a train route, but there are maritime routes, there are river routes, inland waterways, connecting into places like Germany and in the Netherlands, and the British ports are mainly owned by Chinese nationals. So I agree that soft power will take a hit for China, but the digital possibilities of the One Belt, One Road should benefit Europe, and I hope that there's economic partnerships still possible, because and I asked another question about regulation. An over-regulated Europe in a time of a tech war between China and US could dampen economic growth. So.
Okay, I guess the question is going to be for Roberto.
But just a few, just a few words. It's a very interesting question, and thank you, Dan, for that. But let's bear in mind that the German presidency of the European Union, which is starting in July, 1st of July, one of the main priorities will be the dialogue between EU and China, above all after this very peculiar and very tough period that we've experienced. So Berlin will work a lot to reconnect, or maybe to strengthen, some economical ties that we have, the EU, I mean, with China. And about the tech, and not aversion, but you heard about Huawei, you heard about all the tension among China, among Beijing and Washington. There was phase one of a trade deal signed between Washington and Beijing a few months ago. And already now, in this part of just a few months afterwards, Washington is complaining that China does not comply with all the details of this phase one by not buying raw materials, soybeans, etc. So I'm sure that going on towards the US presidential election, tech issues will be on the top priority list and also seen as a threat by President Trump and its administration, and it will be used as a mediatic tool during the campaign.
Thank you. Hope, Dan, that you got your answer. Anthony, can you maybe bring the next question? Phil also asked a question about the third point. I don't know which slide it was mentioned, but you will ask the question. Phil, are you with us?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my question, a lot of what Anthony was saying was that it seemed to be based on the fact that assumption that Donald Trump will be re-elected. If that's not the case, do you still see the same direction globally? Do you think Sleepy Joe will still continue with with a more isolationist view of the US, or would you say that is a reopening towards globalization?
So I guess the question is for me.
Yes.
I mean, you are the fan of Donald Trump, being that you got his.
Behind of me, there is a little statue of Trump and Obama. So it's a well-balanced approach between Democrats and Republicans. Short reply. I was in Washington when Barack Obama was elected more than a decade ago. And I will always remember the European vision of this election was the world will going to change. We're going to have a different approach of multilateralism. The approach with Obama didn't really change. The rhetoric changed, and it's very different now with Donald Trump. It's tougher, it's different. But the trend is here. We have a very clear vision of the world, and even though Biden is elected after November the 3rd, I don't think that the rhetoric and the approach from Washington towards Beijing will change. Maybe there will be a rebalanced approach to social issues like what's going on now in Minneapolis. With Biden, it would be very different, the social dialogue and political dialogue, but also a different approach to multilateralism, maybe more dialogue with the World Health Organization and so on and so on.
Thank you, Roberto.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Roberto. We had Mathieu also who has a question. Mathieu, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Please go ahead, Mathieu.
I had a question about the impact of the current situation on global governance, especially we saw that even the World Health Organization gets hit by the crisis. And you also said that the WTO was disregarded during the crisis. So do you think that, so what's to do with global governance organization like UN or even regional organization like ASEAN or UE as far as concerned?
Yeah, Mathieu. Thank you, Mathieu. So Roberto, can we have a global governance in
we didn't have
anything today?
No, but we didn't have any balanced global governance these past years. But let me quite straight to you, Mathieu. Thank you for the question. I think that the global governance will bounce back and restart with the G7 June 20 meetings. So the next one will be in September, and then the UN General Assembly. We really need a dialogue. We have no choice. Even though Donald Trump is re-elected, we need to dialogue. Do you see what happened with COVID-19? It could happen with a global cyber attack. Maybe it's the next threat for the world. a global cyber attack. So we have to be resilient, and the only way to be resilient is at least to have a dialogue. And will it be the decade or maybe the future of the integrated and regional political organization like the European Union or ASEAN, the Southeast Asia Countries Association? I still don't know, because there is a lack of confidence, and you can see into Europe there is a lack of confidence, but also a rise of populism. So let's wait and see, but the first step will be visible in September with the first summit with the next summit, sorry, of the G7, and then the UN General Assembly in mid-September.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Mathieu, for the question. So on my side, I also have a few other questions. And again, I'm sorry, it's for Roberto, this one. What about Russia? I don't know. I'm always imagining Putin in his couch, you know, laughing about what's going on between China and US, and nobody really thinks about Russia, but it's still a powerhouse in military and economically and in energy. So Roberto, what's your insight about Russia?
So thank you for this question. It's very important, but because you heard during my presentation that the key economical countries for business where you can see new cases of COVID-19 declared is also in Russia. So Russia is still facing a huge threat about COVID-19, and they are also going out of the lockdown these days, but there's still a very big threat over there, and we still don't know about the coming out and how it will happen and how the economy will bounce back. And just to remind you, Russia rely a lot on gas and oil, energy and economy. So they put a lot of cash and fresh cash from their hedge fund, the big hedge fund controlled and managed by the Kremlin, just to bounce back in a better way. But I still I don't see any good and balanced strategy from Moscow right now, and it's kind of a threat the following 3 to 4 months for Russia, and the population also is not very happy with the risk management from Vladimir Putin.
So you don't see Russia as an opportunity for European companies right now?
It depends on the segment. But right now, from the Kremlin, there is a lack of strategic vision for the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months. So it's quite risky. What's going to happen? A second wave or a very long wave? Because everybody, and it can be taken into account also for the US, everybody was talking about the second wave, but we still don't know how this first wave will last in the US, in Russia, and other countries. And it's going to last longer than in our European country.
Thank you, Roberto. You mentioned Vietnam. I didn't expect that. So you mentioned Vietnam for Asia,
yeah,
I guess, as an opportunity. Do you see any other parts of the world that are opportunities for fintechs based in Luxembourg right now, or businesses?
So my key Eldorado just before COVID were still Indonesia, Vietnam, Colombia as well, was working and investing a lot in digital and tech, and also in fintech. Brazil also with a great and very interesting fintech environment. But still now, we have to see what's going to happen with this government. When we talk about Brazil, we have in mind Bolsonaro, the current president, and there is a lack of strategy here. When you hear about what's going on in Europe, they have a strategy, they have a common vision, they have the Green Deal, the Green Recovery Plan. This kind of plan is missing in Europe, in Brazil, is missing in Russia. So just before COVID, I had ideas of Eldorado like Indonesia, Vietnam, Colombia, maybe some part of Brazil, let's see what will happen with the strategy in this country in the following months, and then maybe it will still be a good and great Eldorado for you fintech.
Okay, but right now, after COVID, besides Vietnam, you don't.
Vietnam.
Okay.
For sure,
Vietnam.
for sure, Vietnam.
Okay, guys, let's go to Vietnam then. What's your intake, Gino? Do you see any part of the world that you advise your clients to export the services?
So it really does depend on the priorities, but why not look not so far afield, but also on our doorstep? So UK, Ireland, Netherlands, Germany, they're still hotspots, and especially for US companies. But the US itself, so the US is still the biggest powerhouse in the world, and it's very much polarized in restricted areas. So if you want to crack the Bay Area or Seattle or Boston or New York, those are hubs of talent, wealth, and innovation. And therefore, if a business wants to accelerate very quickly, an expansion into the US isn't something that they should overlook.
Thank you so much. From my side, how I see it, if you want to target North America, I will advise Canada because I live there. Montreal, it's a
Yes.
perfect doorway to US, to New York and Boston,
Yes.
as you mentioned.
Yes.
On the Asian part, you mentioned it, Roberto, Tokyo is becoming very aggressive with what's going on in Hong Kong, trying to steal some business from there. And the partnership we have between Europe and Japan makes the country very interesting for our fintechs. And we also advise them to look into Japan, even if it's quite complicated to develop business afterwards over there. And for the ones that are listening and are not yet based in Luxembourg, I will highly advise to connect with us because there is plenty of opportunities. And I agree with you, Gino. Why going all over the world when you have opportunities next door? So guys, I think we are set. Check out Philippines as well. Thank you, Dan, for the advice. Roberto, do you agree on the Philippines?
Yeah, it can be a good place, but let's stick to Vietnam and Japan, as you said. I think it's two great spots right now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Guys, Gino, Roberto, thank you so much for your advice. Thank you for everybody for listening. I hope it was useful and you saw some opportunities, or at least how to mitigate risk, as Gino mentioned. Yes, Anthony, the mic is yours. Please, if you can close the session.
Of course. So I want to thank all of you for participating in the webinar. I hope you enjoyed it. I just want to share with you briefly the upcoming webinar, what's on the list for the next weeks. Next week, we have a webinar on cloud computing, which one you need to pick in order to accelerate your business. And then on Thursday, we have a joint webinar together with the European Commission that might be of interest to you. Also, an event that we would like to invite all of you, especially the ones that have joined us from abroad today, is our networking session, the FinTech Friday, during which we're going to host a leading VC from the UK. And then also something that might be of interest to you is a session with the OECD. The lady is the head of the blockchain unit, and she's going to give you insights about what is happening in that space. Thank you very much for having been with us today. Thank you.
GF, I wish you all a great weekend. Thank you so much, guys. Let's keep in touch.
Bye-bye.